Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Today, I'd like to talk about the non-aggression principle, also known as the n.a.p, aka the n.a.p. Maybe you've heard it before, or maybe not. But what I would like to do on this episode is explore what exactly is the non-aggression principle and answer the question that I see asked most often: is it biblical? Now, obviously, I'm going to need to set the scene a little. My experience with the question or concern about the n.a.p. and our faith usually pops up when someone who is already a Christian is converting from one of the major political parties, the Republicans or the Democrats, into libertarianism. And that libertarianism doesn't necessarily mean the Libertarian Party. Sometimes I get to speaking about our ideology and philosophy and I forget to make the distinction. But yes, libertarianism with a small or lowercase l is different from libertarianism with a big or capital L. Small l libertarianism is generally preferred among anarchists and not party-loyal libertarians. It designates just the philosophy of libertarianism. The big L libertarian refers to someone pulling for the party much like the other political parties. It speaks to more policy and political advancement with some of the core principles from the small L libertarian philosophy. Obviously, we can get into some hasty generalizations, and we could get into an entire episode of why I think libertarianism, small l, followed to its logical conclusion, leads to anarchism. But the philosophy is where we are staying with this conversation. Agree with it or not, I hope to give a thorough definition and complete presentation of the non-aggression principle. So there are a few places we could start from here, but I think we should begin with defining our terms. Just in the term non-aggression principle, we can already get off track. And when starting here, I'm reminded of something G.K. Chesterton said in the beginning of his book, Orthodoxy. And if you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it. It's short, but packed with his wit. In the beginning of Orthodoxy, Chesterton says, "Anyone setting out to dispute anything ought always to begin by saying what he does not dispute. Beyond stating what he proposes to prove, he should always state what he does not propose to prove." So what does the non-aggression principle not mean? Let's start with non-aggression. What does it not mean? It does not mean pacifism. Non-aggression does not mean no force, no violence, no aggressiveness, no insert any word that means two people fighting with each other. It does not mean that. And what does principle not mean? Principle does not mean a complete moral or ethical system or dogma. So, what it isn't. The non-aggression principle is not an ethical dogma for pacifists. Then, what is it? Non-aggression, when used in the non-aggression principle, or I should say used correctly, means specifically no initiation of aggression, no initiation of force. And this is very important, as we will see further into our study. And principle simply means a rule or tenet of a belief system. So what is the n.a.p? It is a rule concerning the initiation of force. And while we're laying out the definition, I think it's important to add that there isn't a sacred text that provides the meaning of the n.a.p. I'm not sure who exactly coined the term, but we have a long history of people that have written about natural rule that is essentially the non-aggression principle. Let's run through a few quotes that are a foundational part of this principle. In 1689, John Locke said in his second treatise, "Being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." In 1819, Thomas Jefferson argued in a letter, "Rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will within the limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. I do not add within the limits of the law, because law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual. No man has a natural right to commit aggression on the equal rights of another, and this is all from which the laws ought to restrain him." In 1851, Herbert Spencer wrote, "Every man is free to do that which he wills, provided he infringes not the equal freedom of other men." In 1859, John Stuart Mill wrote in his book on liberty, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others." In 1923, Albert J. Nock wrote in his book, Our Enemy the State, Nock relays a king's message that there are only two laws, namely, hurt no man and then do as you please. In the 1961 essay titled Man's Rights, Ayn Rand said, "The precondition of a civilized society is the barring of physical force from social relationships. In a civilized society, force may be used only in retaliation and only against those who initiate its use." And finally, in his 1963 essay, War, Peace, and the State, Murray Rothbard explains, "No one may threaten or commit violence, aggress, against another man's person or property. Violence may be employed only against the man who commits such violence that is only defensively against the aggressive violence of another. In short, no violence may be employed against a non-aggressor. Here is the fundamental rule from which can be deduced the entire corpus of libertarian theory." Coincidentally, I have previous episodes on Albert J. Nock, Ayn Rand, and Murray Rothbard that I will link to in the show notes if you'd like a little bit more information on them. So, with all that established, don't hurt people, don't commit violence, do not harm or infringe. What does the initiate part of this equation mean? I think this actually is the least understood or emphasized part of the n.a.p. And it can set this whole discussion off track from the very start. To really boil this down and give you the least academic example, the most juvenile way that I can explain this is to say, who started it?
Stop it! Wrap it up. You started it.
It's the same thing you ask your kids, who started it? But why do we ask this? Because it matters. It matters who initiated the aggression. It's a natural and an innate part of us when judging a conflict.
He hit me first!
The non-aggression principle speaks to this. It gives you something to fall back on when judging the right or wrong in a situation done by someone else, no matter how good their intentions. And it also, and I would say primarily, acts as a self-guiding principle. What should or shouldn't you do in a situation, even if you have good intentions? Should you initiate aggression? And the great thing is that it applies to everything. Maybe a spat with your neighbor, or even large groups when we start thinking about the way that communities or states or nations act towards other people, or even toward themselves. But to take a small sidestep, but sticking with this childlike example, another way proponents of the n.a.p explain this is in the very simple rule,
Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff.
Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. I think that this particular phrasing of it may have been started by Matt Kibbe in his book titled Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff. This is speaking to that initiation, and it's getting us a little closer to a biblical connection that we're looking for. Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff sounds very similar to two of the 10 Commandments. Do not kill and do not steal. And if you're not familiar, they can be found in Exodus 20, 2 through 17, and Deuteronomy 5, 6 through 21. So we started this out with, is the n.a.p biblical? And the answer really depends on what you mean by biblical. It isn't directly referred to in the Bible, yet it is similar to Christian morals. There's a good case to be made for stolen or borrowed morality from the Christian worldview for things like this, but that's a different discussion. But the answer to our question really lies in what we mean when we ask if it's biblical. What is biblical? Do you mean, is it found specifically mentioned in the Bible, or is it compatible with the Bible's teachings? We do see that there are similarities in the 10 Commandments. Do not kill and do not steal. And this is even what the second greatest commandment sums up when Jesus says to love your neighbor as yourself. And this is also called the Golden Rule. In case you're not familiar, the Gospels record Jesus answering the question, what is the greatest commandment? And he answers back to love God with all of your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And he says the second greatest is to love your enemy as yourself. This is basically splitting the 10 Commandments in half and summing up each half. The first half about loving God, and the second half about loving our neighbor. And it can be found in Matthew 22, 35 through 40, Mark 12, 28 through 34, and Luke 10, 27. So a really good way to love our neighbor is by not hurting them and not taking their stuff. And this gets us into some of the critiques of the n.a.p. Like I mentioned before, the non-aggression principle does not tell you what to do with your neighbor, just what to not do with your neighbor. This conversation is about positive and negative actions. Positive being an action and negative being inaction. It doesn't mean good and bad actions, but it's more similar to positive and negative rights. The n.a.p is inaction. It's negative in that sense. Christianity includes inaction, but it also prescribes actions when loving our neighbor. Biblically, we have an example of how to positively love our neighbor by feeding and helping the needy and the widow and the orphan. The n.a.p. doesn't address any of that. And as I mentioned, that is a critique of the n.a.p. And how I usually answer this critique is to say just that the n.a.p. doesn't pretend to address this. A criticism would be more appropriate if the principle were somehow inconsistent. This isn't inconsistent because it is only addressing the inaction. Do not initiate force and aggression. Another thing it doesn't prescribe is the appropriate level of defense or retaliation. This is another critique again, and it's a misunderstanding that a principle or rule is not a complete ethical system. Most people will have varying appropriate levels of defense, even if we are speaking exclusively within the church. I have episodes on pacifism and the death penalty that I will link to in the show notes if you're interested in some of those topics, where this is talking about the initiation of force, pacifism, and the death penalty get into defense and retaliation and retribution and things like that. So by now, you might be nodding along in agreement, or you might still find it uneasy to affirm the n.a.p. because of its association with libertarianism, small l. But when we look at what it really stands for, it's essentially a universal message of not stealing or initiating aggression against your neighbor. At this point, the only reason why you would reject the n.a.p. is because you think there are times and scenarios that are appropriate to initiate aggression.
I aim to kill you.
I've seen some real in-depth argumentation on when a threat is credible enough that your action is defensive, even if it is kind of preemptive. Like, at what point is a threat credible enough to warrant what may be deemed preemptive, right? Like when someone is pulling back to land a punch on someone's jaw, at what point do you step in before they actually make contact with that person? Or even when a hostile nation is threatening a nuclear attack.
He tried to kill me. What? I said he's trying to kill me.
I think this is a good conversation to have, and one that will likely be ongoing, considering you could never work through every detail and nuance of a conflict between two people, much less two or more nations. But again, this is where I would like to see this conversation go and stay. However, I see a lot of questions and excuses made for initiating aggression against people that are rich, or because the collective demands goods and services. And this isn't just with socialist or communist social welfare programs. This is also about eminent domain, roads, and security. So something to consider is you can't affirm the n.a.p. or simply not initiating force against a peaceful person while also affirming government programs that necessarily depend on the initiation of aggression, or at least the threats of force and aggression, if you do not comply with giving up your money and property. I think both sides of the current two-party duopoly American political system could stand to take some time from their partisan rhetoric and really examine what laws and government programs are really calling for. If you're against initiating force against someone, then you can't advocate for anything that isn't completely voluntary. And if that makes sense to you and you're not familiar with this, please Google voluntarism. Again, I have an episode about voluntarism that I will link to in the show notes. So I hope you liked that dive into the non-aggression principle. Did I leave anything out? Do you think it's a good starting principle or completely short-sighted to the realities of this world? Let me know on social media or wherever you catch this podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episodes on Facebook and the other social media sites. You can support this show with a monthly donation through Patreon. Visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page where you'll find a few ways that you can support us. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.
God said there's a season for every single thing.
I said he's trying to kill me.
Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff.